Picture this. You walk into a voting booth, stare at the ballot, and feel a strange sense of déjà vu. The names are different, the parties wear different colors, but something feels eerily familiar. It's as if you're choosing between different flavors of the same product: Coca-Cola or Pepsi, Ford or Chevrolet, candidate A or candidate B. The packaging varies, but the essence beneath feels manufactured, processed, designed by the same invisible hands. This isn't paranoia. This is the nightmare that French philosopher Jean Baudrillard predicted decades ago. A world where we no longer distinguish between reality and its representation, where the copy becomes more real than the original, where simulation doesn't just influence our politics, it becomes our politics. Think about the last election you witnessed. How much of what you knew about the candidates came from their actual policies, their real track records, their unguarded moments of authentic human interaction? And how much came from carefully curated social media posts, focus-grouped sound bites, professionally shot campaign ads designed to trigger specific emotional responses in your brain? If you're honest, and we must be brutally honest here, you'll realize something unsettling. You weren't voting for a person. You were voting for a brand, a simulation, a copy of what we think a leader should look like, sound like, feel like. Baudrillard called this hyperreality, a condition where simulated experiences become more compelling, more digestible, more real to us than actual reality. In politics, this means we've stopped electing representatives and started electing representations. Not leaders, but the images of leaders. Not authentic voices, but echoes of what authentic voices are supposed to sound like. Here's the terrifying question that should keep you awake at night. If democracy is fundamentally about choice, what happens when all our choices are manufactured? When the very act of voting becomes participation in an elaborate theater where every actor is reading from the same script, just wearing different costumes? Are we still citizens exercising our democratic power? Or have we become consumers, clicking add to cart on prepackaged political products designed to make us feel like we're making meaningful decisions while changing absolutely nothing about the fundamental structures of power? This is Baudrillard's nightmare made manifest. And we're not just living in it, we're actively participating in its construction every time we mistake the simulation for the real thing.
To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to travel back to a time when representation actually meant something. When democracy wasn't a consumer experience, but a radical experiment in human self-governance. The Enlightenment philosophers who conceived modern democracy had a beautifully simple idea. Political leaders should represent the will of the people. Not interpret it, not manipulate it, not manufacture it, represent it. John Stuart Mill wrote about representatives as delegates, carrying the authentic voices of their constituents into halls of power. The relationship was supposed to be transparent, direct, honest. But something happened along the way. Something that would make Baudrillard's analysis not just relevant, but prophetic. The industrial age didn't just mechanize production, it mechanized persuasion. Enter Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations and nephew of Sigmund Freud. In the 1920s, Bernays realized that the same psychological techniques used to sell soap could be used to sell political candidates. He wrote quite explicitly that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses was an important element in democratic society. Read that again. The manipulation of opinions wasn't a corruption of democracy. According to Bernays, it was an essential feature. This marked the beginning of what Baudrillard would later identify as the second stage of representation, when images begin to mask reality rather than reflect it. Political campaigns started hiring advertising agencies. Candidates began to be packaged like products. The goal shifted from authentic representation to effective presentation. Then came television, and with it, one of the most revealing moments in political history: the 1960 Nixon-Kennedy debates. Those who listened on radio thought Nixon won. He was more substantive, more detailed in his policy positions. But those who watched on television thought Kennedy won. Why? Nixon looked tired, sweaty, uncomfortable under the lights. Kennedy looked fresh, confident, presidential. This wasn't just about charisma overcoming substance. This was about the medium fundamentally altering the message. Television didn't just broadcast political reality, it created a new kind of political reality, one where how you looked mattered more than what you said, where the simulation of leadership became more important than actual leadership capability. Baudrillard identified 4 successive stages in the relationship between reality and its representations. First, representation reflects reality. Second, it masks and distorts reality. Third, it masks the absence of any underlying reality. And finally, the most terrifying stage, it bears no relation to reality whatsoever. It becomes pure simulation, existing only to perpetuate itself. By the 1980s, political campaigns had reached Baudrillard's third stage. Ronald Reagan, a professional actor, became president not despite his background in simulation, but because of it. He didn't just play presidential. He understood that being presidential was itself a kind of performance. The line between his political persona and his entertainment persona didn't blur, it disappeared entirely. We had entered an era where political representation no longer represented anything real. Instead, it represented our collective fantasy of what representation should look like. Candidates weren't elected for their ability to govern, but for their ability to embody our idealized image of someone who could govern. And here's what makes Baudrillard's analysis so chilling. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system working exactly as it had evolved to work. We weren't being deceived by simulation. We were actively preferring it to reality. Why do we, as rational human beings, choose the copy over the original? Why do we prefer the simulation to the real thing? The answer lies deep in the architecture of human psychology, in cognitive biases that evolved over millions of years, but are now being exploited by political systems that understand our minds better than we do ourselves. Consider the fundamental human need for identity. We don't just want leaders who will implement good policies. We want leaders who reflect who we think we are, or who we aspire to become. Political campaigns understand this instinctively. They're not selling governance, they're selling identity avatars. When someone votes for a candidate, they're often voting for a version of themselves. The suburban mother who sees her struggles reflected in a candidate's carefully crafted backstory. The working class man who sees his resentments validated in a candidate's rhetoric. The young progressive who sees their idealism mirrored in a candidate's social media presence.
But here's the crucial point. These identities are constructed. The suburban mother's struggles, the working class man's resentments, the progressive's idealism, they're all real. But the candidate's connection to these experiences? That's simulation, focus grouped, A/B tested, optimized for maximum emotional resonance. This is what psychologists call the halo effect, our tendency to let one positive impression influence our overall judgment. If a candidate looks presidential, sounds presidential, feels presidential, we assume they must be presidential. We fill in the gaps with our own projections, creating a complete picture from incomplete information. Social media has supercharged this process. We're now exposed to thousands of micro-interactions with political figures, a tweet here, a video there, a carefully leaked candid moment. Our brains, overwhelmed by information, grab onto simple branding cues. Hope, change, make America great again. These aren't policy positions. They're psychological triggers designed to create the feeling of understanding without requiring actual comprehension. Baudrillard understood something profound about human nature. We often prefer simulation to reality because simulation is cleaner, more digestible, more emotionally satisfying than the messy complexity of actual governance. Reality is full of contradictions, compromises, unintended consequences. Simulation offers clarity, purpose, heroic narratives. Think about your own media consumption. Do you seek out detailed policy papers and voting records? Do you absorb political information through headlines, social media posts, late-night comedy shows? Be honest. Most of us, most of the time, prefer the simulation because it requires less cognitive effort while providing more emotional satisfaction. This creates what Baudrillard called a hyperreality feedback loop. We consume simulated political content, which shapes our expectations of what politics should look like, which influences how candidates present themselves, which creates more simulated content, which shapes our expectations further. At no point in this loop do we necessarily encounter anything that could be called political reality. The most disturbing part is that this isn't happening to us. We're actively participating in it. Every time we share a political meme, every time we reduce complex policy positions to tweet-length takes, every time we judge a candidate's fitness for office based on how they performed in a debate rather than how they've actually governed, we're contributing to the construction of hyperreality. We've become what Baudrillard called hyperreal voters, citizens who have learned to navigate political simulation so fluently that we've forgotten there was ever supposed to be anything else. We don't just tolerate the copy. We've come to prefer it to any original that might have existed. And this preference isn't irrational, it's adaptive. In a world where political reality is increasingly complex, contradictory, and overwhelming, simulation offers the comfort of simplicity. Better to believe in the image of strong leadership than to confront the reality that most of our challenges don't have clear solutions or simple answers. Now, let's step fully into the present moment, into the world we've built, or that has built itself around us. If Baudrillard's analysis felt abstract in the 1980s, it should feel viscerally, urgently real today. We are living through the full flowering of political hyperreality, and the technologies of the 21st century have amplified every mechanism he identified. Consider deepfakes, literally copies without originals. We now have the technological capability to create video footage of political figures saying things they never said, doing things they never did. But the truly unsettling part isn't that this technology exists, it's how quickly we've adapted to it. We now live in a world where the question, "Did this really happen?" has become a standard part of consuming political media.
Even without deepfakes, artificial intelligence is already transforming political campaigns into precision simulation machines. Micro-targeted advertising means that different voters see different versions of the same candidate, each optimized for their psychological profile. You're not just voting for a simulation, you're voting for a simulation that has been specifically designed for you, tailored to your fears, hopes, and biases with algorithmic precision. Social media has turned political engagement into a constant stream of memes, sound bites, and viral moments that bear only the most tangential relationship to governance. Remember the fly that landed on Mike Pence's head during the 2020 vice presidential debate? For days, that insect generated more discussion, more engagement, more emotional investment than any policy position discussed during the actual debate. This isn't accidental. The attention economy rewards spectacle over substance, performance over policy, simulation over reality. Political figures who understand this, who embrace their role as entertainers, content creators, brand ambassadors, thrive. Those who insist on treating politics as a serious business of governance find themselves relegated to the margins, dismissed as boring, out of touch, unelectable. Consider how political debates have evolved. They're no longer forums for substantive policy discussion. They're aesthetic contests, performance art, opportunities for viral moments. Candidates don't prepare by studying issues. They prepare by rehearsing zingers, practicing camera angles, and focus testing facial expressions. The 2016 US election marked a watershed moment in political simulation. We elected a reality TV star who understood instinctively that political success in the hyperreal era requires mastery of media rather than mastery of governance. Trump didn't just use Twitter, he became Twitter, transformed himself into a stream of pure communication, unencumbered by the traditional constraints of political coherence or consistency. But this phenomenon isn't limited to Trump or the United States. Look at Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, a comedian and actor who leveraged his understanding of performance into political power. Or Italy's five-star movement, which emerged from a comedian's blog. Or Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, who built his political brand through a provocative social media presence. These aren't anomalies, they're the logical evolution of political systems that have learned to prioritize simulation over reality. In a hyper-real political environment, the skills that make someone an effective entertainer are more valuable than the skills that make someone an effective governor. The most chilling aspect of our current moment isn't that we're being manipulated by sophisticated political technologies. It's that we're actively collaborating in our own manipulation. We share the memes, engage with the spectacle, participate in the endless reproduction of political simulation. We've become what Baudrillard might have called prosumers of hyperreality, simultaneously consuming and producing the very simulations that shape our political consciousness. Social media algorithms learn our preferences and feed us increasingly refined simulations of political reality. We live in echo chambers that aren't just reinforcing our existing beliefs, they're reinforcing our existing simulations, creating feedback loops within feedback loops, copies of copies of copies, until the original is not just lost, but becomes irrelevant. We are more informed than any generation in human history, yet our information is increasingly composed of fragments, snippets, and curated highlights that create the illusion of understanding while providing only the simulation of knowledge. We know more about politicians' personal lives, their fashion choices, their Twitter habits, than citizens of previous generations knew about their leaders' actual policies or governance philosophies. This is Baudrillard's fourth stage fully realized. Pure simulation bearing no relation to any underlying reality, existing only to perpetuate and reproduce itself.
Our political system has become a closed loop of representation, representing representation, simulation simulating simulation, copies making copies of themselves in an endless hall of mirrors. So where does this leave us? If Baudrillard was right, if we truly live in an age of pure political simulation, what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Retreat into cynicism? Withdraw from political participation entirely? Accept that democracy as originally conceived is dead and gone? The answer is more complex and more hopeful than either despair or denial. First, we must acknowledge a fundamental paradox. Elections are simultaneously crucial democratic rituals and hyperreal performances. They matter tremendously, and they are largely theater. Both things are true. The danger lies not in recognizing this contradiction, but in resolving it too simply, either by treating elections as purely meaningful or dismissing them as purely fake. The path forward requires what we might call conscious participation, engaging with political processes while maintaining awareness of their simulated nature. This doesn't mean becoming cynical, it means becoming sophisticated. It means learning to participate in democracy without being consumed by its spectacle.
Consider what this might look like in practice. Instead of sharing political memes that reduce complex issues to emotional triggers, we might seek out detailed policy analyses. Instead of judging candidates based on debate performances or social media presence, we might examine their actual track records, their funding sources, the concrete effects of their past decisions. But here's what makes this challenging. Reality is harder work than simulation. Understanding actual policy positions requires more cognitive effort than absorbing campaign slogans. Researching voting records is less emotionally satisfying than watching viral political videos. The real is messier, more contradictory, less heroic than the hyperreal. This is why Baudrillard's critique cuts so deep. It reveals that our preference for simulation isn't just a failure of media literacy or political education. It's a fundamental aspect of how human consciousness works in complex societies. We create simulations because reality is overwhelming, and we prefer them because they're more psychologically manageable. The goal isn't to escape simulation entirely. That may be impossible in a mediated society. The goal is to develop what we might call hyperreal literacy, the ability to recognize simulation as simulation while still engaging productively with political processes. This means asking different questions. Not just which candidate do I prefer, but what am I actually voting for? The person or the persona? Not just what do I think about this policy, but how has my thinking been shaped by the information sources I consume? Not just who's winning the election, but what kind of political reality are we collectively constructing through our participation? Perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing that the antidote to hyperreality isn't pure reality, it's a conscious relationship to the boundary between them. We can't step outside the hall of mirrors, but we can learn to see the mirrors as mirrors. The risk of cynicism is real. If everything is simulation, if all candidates are copies, if the entire system is theater, why participate at all? But this response grants ultimate victory to the forces of hyperreality. Withdrawal doesn't restore authenticity. It simply cedes the field to those who understand how to manipulate simulation most effectively. The more radical response is to participate differently. To vote not just for candidates, but for the kind of political reality we want to inhabit. To engage with media critically rather than passively. To demand substance even when spectacle is more entertaining. To create spaces for authentic political dialogue, even when authentic dialogue is less viral than performance. Baudrillard's nightmare isn't that we live in a world of copies.
It's that we might forget there was ever supposed to be an original. The act of remembering, of maintaining awareness of what authentic democratic participation could look like, becomes itself a form of resistance. Here's the final paradox. In an age of infinite copies, the most radical act might be the attempt to be real. Not perfectly real, that's impossible in a mediated world, but consciously real, deliberately authentic. If every candidate is a simulation, then perhaps our vote isn't just a choice between options, it's a choice about what kind of choosers we want to be. Do we want to be consumers of political products, or citizens engaged in the messy, difficult, essential work of self-governance? Do we want to live in Baudrillard's nightmare, or do we want to dream something better into existence? The answer to that question can't be simulated. It can only be lived.